an interesting.
Now, I just want to say one thing, just to make sure that something that got picked up that Joe said in his talk. So we've been talking about these two Republican senators, James Eastland and John Stennis.
They're Democratic.
Mississippi senators, I must say, they are Democrats. Yeah, these two Democratic senators. And I think both from Sunflower County.
No, one is from Kemper, and one is from Sunflower.
But Eastland is a plantation owner in Sunflower County, and they have very different styles, right? Both of them reflect, as Thurman did, as Jesse Helms did, one of the things that Southerners do that becomes very important in them exercising influence is they return the same people to the Senate over and over and over. And the Senate, which has very strict rules of seniority, means that the people who run the committees are based on seniority, mostly, not exclusively, but mostly. And if you're a committee chairman, you can, as James Eastland said, put a bill in your pocket and come up with procedures that it's never, ever going to get out of your committee. And so this was one of the things that the Republicans did. So you have
the Democrats.
The Democrats said
I mean, it's interesting that they're Republican in my head, but they're Democrats historically. So Eastland, is head of the Justice Department. So for example, every judge John Kennedy wants to appoint to the federal court has to go through Jim Eastland's committee. So when John Kennedy, for example, wants to promote Thurgood Marshall to the federal court before he's going to appoint to the Supreme Court, he's got to go to Jim Eastland. And Jim Eastland allegedly, and he uses the N-word, tells Kennedy, you can have your N judge. And the quid pro quo is that Eastland's roommate or friend from law school, a guy named Harold Cox, has to be appointed to the federal bench at the same time. And so all of the civil rights trials, in the Philadelphia murder, for example, are in the courtroom of Harold Cox. And so Stennis is running Senate Armed Services, Jesse Helms, for a long time running the Senate. He becomes Senate Foreign Relations Committee chairman. So that's one of the things they do.
But Helms is a Republican.
Helms is
The flip side of that is that the federal judges who were appointed in the 50s by Eisenhower tend to be the most liberal and progressive of the federal judges throughout the Civil Rights era. So John Minor Wisdom and Elbert Tuttle, both of who are federal judges on the U.S. Court of Appeals out of New Orleans. Minor Wisdom is John Minor Wisdom. He's from Louisiana. And he is by far the most liberal judge on that key appeals court. And the Holmes versus Alexander case I was talking about earlier, it's decisions that come out of the Fifth Circuit that lead to that. So Minor Wisdom is a kind of a sub-Supreme Court figure who's very important in this history, and none of those federal judges with the Democratic appointees were progressive on civil rights issues.
But the point I just wanted to amplify of Joe, so James Eastland had a kind of old school, kind of reactionary white supremacist politics that was pretty close to the surface. John Stennis was a much more elegant, sophisticated, soft-spoken kind of person. And in a way, one of the things that I took from reading Joe's book was that the resistance to civil rights embodied by someone like James Eastland in Mississippi could not prevail. James Eastland would have to, in a sense, this is your question in a way too, James Eastland would have to be swept aside. But John Stennis...
Well, see, Eastland is perceived to have been the Mississippi senator that did the dirty work.
Yeah.
Stennis, on the other hand, was the senator who had taken Bilbo's slot when Bilbo died of cancer, and was the Southern gentleman that didn't have as much dirt on his hands as a James Eastland may have had.
And not as much as a political boss as Eastland was.
Yeah, I mean, because in the Delta, everything had to go through Big Jim.
But so what I want to ask you about this, but also just to make sure people picked up, is when Joe referred to the Stennis Amendment, what John Stennis does in 1970, so this is when, it's not really 54, it's 70, when Mississippians are looking down the barrel of integrating public education. John Stennis attaches this amendment to a bill that basically says all right, you're right. We shouldn't have segregation. Segregation's terrible. Let's integrate our schools, and let's integrate them everywhere. So for the first time now, federal law is going to begin to push northern school districts to integrate. And he does it, oddly enough, by finding common cause with the most left-wing congressmen from the Democratic Party who've been saying this all along, that we should integrate everywhere, right? And my question is, to what extent is this just like a really, really cynical move on Stennis's part? He reckons that all these northerners who are giving us trouble, if we give them some of their own medicine and they start having to integrate their schools, you watch them change their tune. In a way, he's setting the stage for what will become the kind of Reagan Democrats.
That's absolutely, it's totally a cynical ploy if you look at his papers. He's doing it intentionally to draw out a response in the North. I mean, this is what segregationists believe all along, right? Is they believe that if white folks outside the South were in their shoes, they would act exactly the way that white Mississippians acted. And that had been the kind of party line for segregationists, at least since '48, when Thurman leads the Bulge, right? But even earlier, before that. And so that's exactly what Stennis is trying to do with the Stennis Amendment, is provoke a response by pushing desegregation everywhere, in all de facto situations, wherever it exists, north or south. He and other segregationist supporters are convinced it's going to provoke a response in the North that's going to then allow Congress to pass provisions that will help Southern segregationists. And Congress doesn't quite act in that way, but it does certainly provoke a response like you see in Boston, but before that in Detroit, in Pasadena, in Denver. All of these were areas that had very contentious de facto segregation lawsuits that were argued over in those local areas.
Now, one other thing I wanted to mention, because I realized I never got to it, and I had put it on the pretest, so I want to make sure I mention it. But it's related to this about cynical attempts that produce unexpected results. Talk about is it Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act?
Yes.
Tell them that story.
Well, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which is of course designed to end racial discrimination in public accommodations and so forth, also includes a part that bans discrimination on the basis of sex. Right? And this was inserted into the bill by the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, Representative Howard Smith of Virginia, who opposed the Civil Rights Act and thought that if we include a ban on sex discrimination, that would actually make it harder to pass the Civil Rights Act, because people who were willing to vote for a law that would ban racial discrimination would not be ready to vote for a law that bans sex discrimination. So, but it passed. It still passed. But the sex discrimination provision was not very important. It was kind of an afterthought. And so, after the Civil Rights Act is passed, there's a new agency set up to enforce it called the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. The first chairman of it is a man with a name that you might have heard before. His name is Franklin Delano Roosevelt Jr. He's the son of the former president. He famously gives an interview to newspapers where he says basically that sex discrimination provision was a joke. We're not going to enforce it. He said, after all, I wouldn't want to apply for the job of Playboy Bunny, and the woman wouldn't want to apply for the job of, I think it was tugboat operator or something like that. And he makes a joke about it. Well, then they're stunned, in fact, because when they start to receive complaints under the Civil Rights Act, they get thousands of sex discrimination claims. I think more sex discrimination claims than race discrimination claims in that first year and a half. And they begin to ignore it, which is one of the things that actually galvanizes the creation of NOW, the National Organization for Women, and the sort of the growth of a women's liberation movement.
Show us the thing.
Let's hope it's going to work. Oh, yeah, it's-
America is in trouble today, not because her people have failed, but because her leaders have failed. We see Americans dying on distant battlefields abroad. We see Americans hating each other, fighting each other, killing each other at home. We see cities enveloped in smoke and flame. We hear sirens in the night. As we see and hear these things, millions of Americans cry out in anguish. Did we come all this way for this?
Pay attention to the music. Change in it.
Let us listen now to another voice. It is the voice of the great majority of Americans, the forgotten Americans, the non-shouters, the non-demonstrators. They are not racist or sick. They are not guilty of the crime that plagues the land. They are black and they are white, native-born and foreign-born, young and old. They work in America's factories. They serve in government. They run America's businesses. They provide most of the soldiers who died to keep us free. They give drive to the spirit of America. They give steel to the backbone of America. They give lift to the American dream. They are good people, decent people. They work, they save, they pay their taxes. They care. Like Theodore Roosevelt, they know that this country will not be a good place for any of us to live in unless it is a good place for all of us to live in. This, I say, is the real voice of America. And in this year, 1968, this is the message it will broadcast to America and to the world.
So,
That's a Nixon campaign commercial.
Did that really air?
oh yes, it aired. It was, and so actually the campaign consultant that Nixon hired in 19, so Nixon was not very good on television or using television. Kennedy, who he ran against in 1960, of course, was brilliant at it. So when Nixon runs again in 1968, he knows that he actually has to take the medium of television seriously. No one had made ads like this before. Most campaign ads, you just see the candidate's face talking, right? So this was so he hires a team of people with television experience, and his top media advisor is a man, in 68, is a man named Roger Ailes, who you might know now as the president of Fox News or CEO of Fox News, but has been a media advisor to a number of Republican presidential candidates. But so this is sort of in the history of political media, this is sort of a landmark. But I showed it because, it was exactly the kind of appeal that Jim was talking about. And I think one of the things that's interesting about it is how in that first half, that music is like, it's really grating, it's dissonant, it makes you uncomfortable. And there's these quick-cut images of the war in Vietnam, along with violence on the streets in the United States, and the things, and it cuts from one to another, it kind of mushes them together. And then Nixon comes in praising the non-shouter, the non-demonstrator.
People who
He's
work
not
hard,
racist
follow
or
their
sick.
taxes.
Yeah, and you got that sort of uplifting, patriotic music.
But this is also the argument of Joe's book too, right? You can't say, I'm appealing to the silent majority, i.e. you white folk, right? So that explicit racial appeals are not allowed. So you have to include in your happy pictures of happy, hardworking Americans, black and brown faces as well. And you have to say, they're black and they're white. This is not race. But so much of the broader narrative, or the underlying narrative about riots in our ghettos and protesters and hippies and all of that is a racial appeal, but it no longer can be explicitly racial.
And this is a teacher, I mean, this is what's interesting to think about as teachers, right? In one way, you can tell that story is, this is about the persistence of racism in our politics, that racism then it becomes a part of these code words that Republicans use to win votes and that kind of thing. Or you could tell that story about how what the civil rights movement does is create a baseline of tolerance, of diversity, that then, you know, it's not substantive, it won't be worked out for decades and decades, but at least in the, you know, you can't run a political campaign that doesn't include white and black faces.
That's right.
And that itself is a kind of notable moment, you know, a notable change. So I think, you know, when you talk with your students, it's complicated about how, you know, this is a fundamental issue about what changes and what stays the same. This is what historians are always arguing about. It's continuity versus change. And I think you see both continuity and change in that advertisement.
Yeah, yeah. Let's open this up, because we've just been chattering.
I have a question back to Stennis and Wallace, because when we talk about George Wallace, one of the things that my students, they always ask is, did he really change? And so I was a little confused about Stennis, because for a minute I thought she said, you know, he had to come to Jesus, but did he really, or was he just kind of playing the political game? And the same question for Wallace.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, first of all, I don't know.
Well, we don't know somebody's real heart.
Yeah,
but,
I don't know, and that's,
like,
but this is what, we all want to know this question. We want to know the question about what, you know, did Strom Thurmond change, did George Wallace, did John Stennis? And, you know, you can't answer it in you know, in terms of what changed in their heart and what they really thought, and that kind of thing. We can, as a historian, as a political historian, you can look at their actions, and you can try to figure out what their motives were for those actions. And in Thurmond's case, it's clear what the motivations were. And it wasn't any kind of slow, gradual realization that he'd been on the wrong side of history and wanting to get on the right. Thurmond's change was motivated entirely around the 1970 midterm elections, that he read the political tea leaves and looked at the local situation and realized he had to change immediately. And so he goes out and hires, in early 1971, the first black staffer to be on the staff of any Southern senator. Strom Thurmond hires him. Now Wallace, you know, and Stennis are more complicated. You know, Wallace he runs, you know, 4 times. And he runs 4 times in 4 different situations. In '64, he just tries his hand out in a couple of Democratic primaries. In '68, he runs as an independent, not in the Democratic Party. But then in '72 and '76, he runs. In '72, he's really wreaking havoc in the Democratic primaries, because that was a really divided year. You had anti-war candidates, and then and it showed how divided the Democratic Party was, because he wins some early primaries in '72. And you know, so Wallace, I think, never, you know, evolves in any kind of profound way, but Wallace's great skill is as a campaigner, and not as a governor, not as an administrator, not as you know, getting things done for people, but he had a skill of going in there and kind of touching on those brainstem issues for white working class voters in the South and in the Northeast. So how much does Wallace change? Sure. These are also, I mean, these are highly evolved political animals. People like John Stennis and George Wallace and Strom Thurmond. I mean, they are pros, right? You don't get to be a senator. You don't get to be a presidential candidate if you can't read the electorate and make hard decisions and put yourself out there in certain ways. And so they're going to do what they need. You know, that's what I think you've got to keep in mind about these people. We don't know what their hearts were. And as a historian, I'm not particularly interested in finding out what it is. I'm interested in looking at the dynamics of how they're shifting and what those shifts tell us about the broader electorate.
But the reason that many people would think that Wallace was genuine is that Wallace had begun as a disciple of an Alabama politician named Big Jim Folsom, who had actually been what passed for a racial moderate at that time, and when, in the post-Brown period, when massive resistance is whipped up, Folsom is seen as not enough of a segregationist. And then in Wallace's first campaign for the governorship in Alabama, where he loses in the Democratic primary to a guy named, I think, John Patterson. John Patterson is the most vociferous, extremes, defend segregation forever candidate. Wallace is more reasonable, and that's when he, depending on an oft-quoted remark in which he says that he's never going to again allow anybody to get to that side of him on the issue.
Uses the N-word, I will never get out and again.